welcome to ABA Inside Track, the podcast that's like reading in your car, but safer. I'm your host, Robert Perry Cruz, and with me as always, coming in hot from a Halloween party. Actually, no, you're not coming in hot from a Halloween party, guest one or co-host one.
I'm coming in hot from a good long sleep because I have a headache. Okay. So this is Jackie.
Hi, it's Diana.
I'm so glad we don't have a guest on this episode, folks, on this podcast about behavior analysis and behavior analytic research, because every week we pick a topic, we discuss relevant research. And of course, talking about behavior analysis stops for no one. No matter what you're doing, you got to drop it all. Just like Skinner says, drop it all, learn, talk about it. And that is what we are going to do tonight on our episode, where we are talking all about generalization, or perhaps we're talking about generality, or maybe it's both.
Dun, dun, dun.
It's a spooky treat for all of you. We're recording this on All Hallows Eve.
Even though it comes out at the end of November.
Even though you will be getting this post-Thanksgiving. Bring it back to the chill wind of generalization. Yes, so we will be talking all about the differences between generalization, generality, why you might use different terms. We're going to be talking about 2 articles related to the field and how that applies to all of us as practitioners. So Diana, please, I think we've done everything for our introduction.
I think so.
Good. Then we should get started by talking about what 2 articles we will be discussing tonight.
Sure. So we're taking it way back tonight. We're going all the way back to the 70s.
Whoa.
I got my bell bottoms on. I got my roller skates on. I got my Farrah Fawcett hair.
You got a brand new pair of roller skates?
Going, yep. You got the brand new key, right? Yeah. Exactly.
I think we should get together and try them out and see.
And we are going to be talking about 2 articles from the 70s. The first is titled An Implicit Technology of Generalization. That is by Stokes and Bear, and it might be something that you've encountered before. It was published in Java in 1977. But then we're going to follow it up with another article that it's possible you haven't read before, which is titled On the Relation Between Generalization and Generality, and that is by Johnston. It was published in the Behavior Analyst, 1979.
So these are articles that some of you may have read back in grad school, back in the day, you've thought about a few times, but they are also articles that, while they came sort of post our 68, what's ABA type of articles, are so important to any of the work that we do as practitioners, because as we all know, the goal of behavior analysis is to affect socially significant change. And if you can do that in your lab, that's awesome. If the only place you can do that in your lab, not so awesome, because the change has to be relevant across a multitude of individuals, environmental contexts. So what we're going to be talking about tonight is what these 3 authors felt about generalization as a component of behavior change. And we're going to be talking a lot about terms and terminology. I'm guessing both of you have read these articles prior to preparing for this podcast. You heard of them before? Don Bear, our buddy?
No, I've actually done the train and hope method for this podcast.
This was Diana's idea.
Yeah.
So we have her to blame.
Well, I think this is a really important topic, right? And like you said, Rob, we are very good at introducing behavior change in a particular setting. That's something that we know and love how to do, right?
Every week we talk about like 3 or 4 perfect examples of that.
True. Every week we talk about that. And what I often say, and I probably have said on this show before, is we can implement change in one setting, and that's all well and good. But if we don't implement change or see that behavior change generalized to other settings in which the participant or the client is going to actually be living and working and experiencing their life, we don't see the change in that setting, then we really and truly have not done our job, right? Just teaching someone to identify emotions on a set of flashcards, for example, is not actually a really very meaningful task for them if they can't then utilize that information in an actual setting and be able to identify if they themselves are happy or sad, or someone else is happy or sad, and how that might then change their response. So the generalization piece isn't something that we should think of as an afterthought for our behavioral planning and programming. It should be at the forefront of our mind and of our clinical preparations that we have for our clients. So this is an extremely important topic. And while we're going to get into the weeds on like the difference between generalization and generality and what all these terms mean, presumably, the big picture point is no matter what you call it, we should be planning for how we're going to ensure that things that we've taught and behavior change that we've, implemented actually occurs in meaningful environments as our top priority as behavior analysts.
Mm-hmm. One of the pieces that I also think is important in regards to planning for generality/generalization would be the idea that I think this is a term that, while it probably required, this level of intense discussion back in the 70s, a lot of us probably take for granted. That idea of like, yeah, of course I want to plan for generalization. Of course I want to plan, or I want to teach skills that have good generality. But I've also found, sort of working in schools, that this is a term that's actually been used kind of as a weapon at various times. I've had individuals who look at a plan I wrote and they say, well, it hasn't generalized to all of the settings and all of the people. Sort of like this idea of, while there's an understanding that generalization is not something that sort of just spontaneously, jumps out of the head of the behavior analyst, it is something you have to plan, it's got to be on the paper, that any skill you teach is a failed skill without generalization. And while to some extent I agree, we also do have to acknowledge that many skills that are taught in certain environments are relevant only to those environments. So the question is not every skill we teach as behavior analysts should have generality, so much as what goes into generality? When is it important? When might it not be important? And then how can we plan and program for it rather than that train and hope? Sometimes it happens, sometimes it doesn't. Big shrug, we'll figure it out when it happens or doesn't happen. And so that's really what we're going to be talking, I think, more about tonight, is that process.
Yeah, and I think to your point, is a lot of the times as behavior analysts, when you're looking at like IEP objectives, right, there isn't a venue to advocate for generalization or generality in those IEP objectives, right? So they're just looking at one setting because that's the setting that data can be collected in, and that may not be the way that behavior analysis wants to go, right? So we don't want to just teach to the school and then be like, good luck, parents, with the little... Ooh, what's that? What is that?
The Close Encounters of the Third Kind song?
No, I remember it. I can't remember.
I don't know.
I'm struggling to find the context of your song, too.
It's a movie.
Mm-hmm. All right, now we're playing charades. Here we go.
Right. Two words. Hunger Games.
Oh.
That's what it was.
Okay.
Right? So we're not, like, teaching a skill that's going to be applicable only to school and then saying, good luck, parents, you're on your own. You're in the world to Hunger Games. That's what I was getting. That's the song.
Okay.
So you guys haven't watched Hunger Games enough?
I guess
not.
To know the song.
I saw it once.
Me too. I don't know why that stuck. And I think that when we all talk about the Stokes and Baer article, they talk about in the 70s, generalization not being a super concern, but it should be one of those fundamental things that when we're planning for things, that we're always taking into consideration when this behavior should occur and when it should not. Mm-hmm. Oh, that was long-winded. Sorry.
So, well, you did have that tangent about the Hunger Games theme song, I think. Katniss Everdeen, that's the character, right?
I wouldn't know that, but...
but the song. Well, why don't we start with Stokes and Baer, 77 article? Because as I texted the group, Stokes and Baer's article really reads like your mentor who really cares about your development as a behavior analyst, and they really want you to understand the term and understand how we can improve our science. Whereas I think Johnston reads a little bit like, that grumpy professor that you had like one class with and you're like, oh, I can't believe anyone works with that guy. He seems to know so much. Like, I get he's super smart, but I don't think he's interested in helping me be super smart so much as just get in my face about how dumb I am.
Well, I think the audience is different, right? So you have to think about who's reading it, right? I think Stokes and Baer were writing this to a young audience, right? 10 years even before Johnston wrote. And so they're
just two.
It was just two.
Just two. JK. That was 10. JK. So they're still a younger audience, 2 years. And I'm wondering, too, if Stokes and Bear were the people that were like laying out our field as it was coming about, right? So I think they were trying to educate, whereas Johnson was trying to, narrow down the focus so that we're being precise researchers and precise technicians. So that's kind of where the audience is different.
I feel like I like Johnston's article in a lot of ways, and I think it's going to be exciting to discuss. But at the same time, it definitely has an old man yells at cloud energy to it that I felt like
Johnson
Stokes
is
and Bear were
coming to
like,
get you.
I'm visiting my favorite grandparents, and they love me so much. They're going to share all these great
They
tips.
were young when they wrote this.
Well,
Not
now
many
they're
people can
grandparents.
write an article like that.
Yeah.
No, that's true.
I'll say that.
If you are out there and you're going to write an article that I'm going to read, please write it like my caring grandparents, all right? I appreciate it. Thanks. So
I think it makes sense to start with Stokes and Bear because it came first of the two articles. And everyone has probably had, or maybe not everyone, but many people have had contact with this article in some capacity. So I think it is a good idea for us to just kind of review what the contents of that article are. We can go through all the 9 tactics for generalization, or are there really only 8, right? And then
there's seven in this one. The 68 version, they bring in all 9.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So we're reading the even before time when there's only 7.
well,
Not 68 then.
I think that this one has. I mean,
89?
this one has 7, but they're going to tell.
yeah.
They're going to tell us 9, but they're going to tell you
my
that 2
bad.
of them aren't
Aren't
really
really-
generalization
yes,
strategies
okay.
so
Yeah,
much
okay,
as
fine.
the null hypothesis.
So anyway,
pretty much.
I think it would make sense for us to go through those because those sometimes people need refreshers on what they actually mean, and then we can rebut with the Johnston and see if we can't bring out some of his main points.
All right. Well, why don't we start with the discussion of generalization as we talk about it. Stimulus and response generalization is usually what we're thinking about when we talk of generalization. And as we're going to discuss, there's a lot more to it than just the idea of I want this behavior to occur with lots of stimuli around it, or I want various stimuli to elicit a number of different responses. Like
You mean evoke.
Evoke. I know. Sorry. I said it as I said it. I feel like I did not turn into the skid on that one. Evoked, different responses, and that's usually I think where a lot of people think of generalization. That idea of like, okay, well, I want this to work everywhere, and wouldn't it be great if a couple different stimuli also led to different responses that were similar but close enough? They're all in the same class occurring. That'd be nice and free teaching.
Yeah.
And that's the last I'll think of this, and I'll just hope I do the best I can.
So I think of generalization as the opposite of discrimination. I think that helps students a lot, right? Because we all learn about discrimination and how we need to teach discriminated responding with our students, right? That's like the first thing you learn in week 1, behavior technician land, right? They're like, when you put up this picture of a dog, you want them to touch a dog and not things that might look like a dog. And so,
Like a fuzzy cat.
right? Like a fuzzy cat that may be called dog. But I always like to think of generalization as the opposite of discrimination first, right? Because I think discrimination is an easier concept for people to get, right? And then because there's usually not faulty discriminative responding, right? And so that's how I kind of, when I talk about generalization, discrimination, I talk about discrimination first. And generalization is the spreading of those effects in untrained environments, which could or could not be warranted, right?
Yep.
So there's some faulty stimulus control sometimes that will lead, that's a generalized response, but it might not be something that we would necessarily want to see. And the most common example is when you have like a baby, right? And you're holding your baby and you have a beard as the dad, and the baby calls you dad, and then sees all other dudes with beards and calls them dads as well, right? This is an example of faulty stimulus control, an example of generalization, but you don't necessarily want that type of generalization.
Yeah, and I think Stokes Bear sort of reiterates some of that point too, Jackie, in some of the tips they have, and almost the idea of, maybe it'd be easier if we started with generalization and then moved to tight, stimulus control. We moved to that discrimination, because the generalization part is the piece that tends to be missing. I mean, and especially if you're a researcher, what's your goal? I need to publish this research. It needs to demonstrate clear experimental control, which means it probably should have some stimulus control. And if it were sort of just, I did some stuff and all sorts of behavior occurred in all sorts of environments, you're not going to get published on that study, even though that might be a meaningful teaching procedure to use because of, whether you're teaching loosely or you're teaching with, so many exemplars.
Well, that's the danger with the multiple baseline across skills or settings design is that you'll get generalization sometimes across those conditions, which is great for your participant, but not for your experimental control.
Right. And so when Stokes and Bears were looking at this, they looked at over 120 research articles, which is so many research articles.
This article definitely has a kind of old school feel, sort of like when you read Verbal Behavior and Skinner's like, I didn't do an experiment on all this stuff, but I've done so many experiments in my life, and here are some general principles I've found. I think this kind of falls into that category of like, listen, we've been doing this for a while, kids. Here are some kind of categories that we're noticing all of the articles tend to fall into across this continuum of lack of generalization to probably lots of generalization being reported on and occurring.
Yeah, I was so surprised when I was like, oh, did you just get bored one day? They're just like, oh, I wonder what the literature says about generalization. I'm going to find everything. Yeah. I'm going to find all 120 articles and just sit down on a weekend, read them, and then categorize them. Like, what did that look like?
I mean, Stokes and Bear, 77, they probably just read those articles as they were published across their, research.
Flung them into corners, into the living room. They have 9 different, chairs in their living room, and one's like the train and hope chair.
Well, I think there's an interesting context there that you bring up, and certainly they bring up in the article, because I know when I read this article, even 2 years ago, I think was the last time I read this for, a work-related question, and I sort of just thought it as Stokes and Bear, they're smart guys, they came up with these categories, right? I didn't really pay attention to the fact that, no, this is based in the research that was being published at the time and earlier. This wasn't just we're super smart, here's some ideas, take them or leave them. This was, these are the categories that research was falling into at the time. Which, I wonder if anyone's done the Stokes and Bear Revisited. Let's add another 500 articles. Those same 9 categories the same? Do we see more in the pie chart of, these 9 options? Where is the research falling these days?
It's going to be a horrible somebody's dissertation.
Yeah, right.
Review
700-page super boring review article dissertation on all the articles since 1977.
I think it kind of helps to think about how this article is structured if you think about it that way. That they were coming from, let's look across all of this different literature at how people are utilizing and planning for generalization, and then that's how we came up with these categories instead of the other way around.
Yeah. I still like the idea of my 9 different chairs in the living room, though.
I do too.
It just seems like a messy mess. They come in with their little short glasses full of liqueur in some form or other.
Probably scotch. Feels like a scotch time.
What chair shall we sit in today? Huh?
So I guess that's a pro tip if you're just starting out in your career. Just as you read research, figure out a category you want to throw articles into, and then 20 years from now, you can write a really seminal paper on here's 9 or 6 categories I discovered related to theme X.
And then someone can come and clean your house because you'll be effectively a hoarder.
Unfortunately, that manuscript was never written. They were crushed by all of the research they were saving.
Yeah, manuscripts during this time period.
All right, you could make 9 folders that you sort of just kept saving things into and looked at. All right, so to start, there was some historical context when Stokes and Bear were publishing. The sort of assumption was generalization was not of interest. The idea was, well, you either have good stimulus control or you don't have good stimulus control. And if behavior is not occurring across environments, it's because you didn't have the right amount of stimulus control or stimulus control in certain environments. So this is sort of that, I don't know what every researcher was thinking in the late 70s, as I was not alive, but that idea of this is its own active process. This isn't sort of just the back end, spew of what's left after your discrimination procedure has occurred, and maybe generalization occurs, maybe it doesn't, but it's passive. This is the active idea of generalization, and really thinking about the goal as how can we promote generalization, not just as, again, the way I used to read this article of tell me, Stokes and Bear, what are your tips and tricks for promoting generalization, so much as there is not enough research being done about exactly what goes into an active process of generalization in our planning. So here are the categories we're seeing that need more work. They need more research and discussion by the field at large. So they give us a nice definition. We've talked about generalization. We've given some sort of less maybe precise definitions, but the definition in Stokes and Bear, I'm just going to quote right from the article, is the occurrence of relevant behavior under different non-training conditions without the scheduling of the same events in those conditions as has been scheduled in the training conditions. So I think that's an important part of just saying, well, I have this great token board, or I have this great reinforcement procedure. What if I just ran that everywhere the child lives or engages in whatever the behavior of note is would not be an example of generalization the way that Stokes and Baer see it. It might be effective, it might be needed even in some situations, but we wouldn't call that generalization. That would just be extending
implementation.
Yeah, extending the implementation of your treatments. So from all of these studies, we've got some patterns. So let's start with everybody's favorite, train and hope.
This one is sad to me, but I can say that I actually have done the train and hope method.
Everyone's done that. If anyone out there is listening, you're listening right now and you're saying, I've never done train and hope. You're a liar. You're a liar. You need to reflect on the lies you are giving.
It gave me some hope, but also led me to pause that when they're talking.
And training too.
Right. It led me to pause that. And they said that most of the studies that they reviewed were doing train and hope. Mm-hmm. And then I was like, okay, well, I'm not alone. But then I was like, but that was the 70s. Mm-hmm. And why am I still training and hoping? Right? Why am I still... in the 90s and 2000s and 2020s, whatever, however you say that now, why are still people training and hoping?
Mm-hmm. And one thing I picked up this time reading the section on train and hope was less, because I always sort of read it as like Stokes and Baer sort of dismissively talking about train and hope.
I think so.
And they really weren't. It really was that idea of, this is what most individuals are publishing right now, or a lot of individuals are publishing right now. I think it was like, they cited like about 90% of the literature we're looking at had this train and hope component. And they weren't flat out rejecting the idea that train and hope is an inappropriate way to think of generalization, but they were more, I don't know if bemoaning's the right word, but they were sort of
That's
sad.
usually never the right word, I think.
You don't like bemoaning? They just seem sort of sad of like, but all of these studies where we could have been learning so much more about what goes in to the process of generalization, where it was just sort of allowed to be ignored. Mm-hmm. Were these studies just not reporting on generalization occurring, not occurring? Was there a failure of generalization that would be important to know? And also the idea of a lot of people are probably publishing and they don't publish their failures of generalization because no one wants to publish failed papers or failed experiments. But that failure might actually be a key component of learning, well, what does work for generalization? If we know what doesn't work, we can sort of hone in on what are the relevant components. So I did really appreciate, and again, kind of went down to that sort of warm hug of an article that I think this is, of even if you are doing train and hope, the problem is not that you're doing train and hope. The problem is that you're missing the relevant pieces of your procedure that may inform your future procedures or your future treatments for your client or for the individual, because we need to know what doesn't work as well as we need to know what does work.
Yeah, I think I read it as more of the easy way out, right? If it happens, yay, you've done it, you can move on with your life. But then when a problem arises, you don't have the necessary knowledge to then fix that problem because you moved on with your life before you actually knew how it happened and why it happened that way.
Yeah. So if you're going to train and hope, it's not that you shouldn't train and hope. It's that, well, you're going to lose a lot of useful information. So wouldn't it be better to think of some of the other strategies so that you can gather more information? So don't worry if generalization doesn't occur, as long as you planned to sort of understand what happened or what didn't happen.
And have a plan. If you're going to be training and hoping, have a plan for if the hoping isn't hoped out.
Yeah, what are your hope red flags?
Expect generalization to occur under this method.
Yes. If it does, great. But you also then don't understand why it did occur in that situation.
Right.
Because train and hope might work. You might be a blessed clinician where train and hope has worked 99% of the time for the skills you've been teaching. But why?
You're like that good.
Yeah, you just imbue generalization in every pore of your being.
If you're that good, you're probably using some of these strategies and not realizing it, right?
So, exactly. Right. Then you want to up your game. You want to understand. Well, that's like next level. That's next level behavior analysis. But sort of the second principle they discuss is the idea of sequential modification. So that idea, and you see this a lot when you're reading articles from the 70s and the 80s and even the 90s of, we ran a study in this setting and it was super successful, and then it didn't see, the behavior didn't generalize to any other setting. So we ran the same study in a different setting, and lo and behold, generalization seemed to occur. And then maybe we did a third or even fourth setting and generalization occurred. So
I like to call this one train and hope and train.
Yeah.
Train and hope and train. And no, I like to call it train, hope, change something little, then train. And hope.
Well, train, the second train is in the new
Yeah, this is
different
the new thing,
location.
right? Change something a little bit, doing one kind of change.
Yeah.
But you know what that change is, not changing everything.
Yeah.
But it's a one tiny change because that's the sequential part, right?
Yeah.
You're slowly changing one aspect of the part before you like change it all.
It feels like the world's laziest component analysis of like, I don't know, what can we do really quickly in this new setting? Did it work? Oh, it didn't. All right, what if we added the second part? Okay, did that work? Yes, it did. Hooray, we're done. Congratulations, everybody.
But if you haven't planned for it, then this might be what you end up doing. And the end result is what you wanted, which is that you see generalized behavior change, but
Yes.
Just might take a
it
little
might
longer.
be slow.
So again, it's not like if you are a train and hoper or a sequential modifier, you're a bad person or a bad clinician. You just are missing a lot of useful information in the goal of efficient treatments.
And, I have tried to use these other tactics in some place and still failed, right? So as like a behavior analyst, I'm like, oh, I'm going to, our next one, introduce, the natural maintaining contingencies and have failed, right? And did not produce what I wanted as my behavior change. So then I did have to go back and use sequential modification, right? So it's not like you only can do sequential modification after train and hope, which some of my students say, right?
Yeah.
They're like, oh, I've trained in hope and now I can use sequential. You can use all of these together,
Right.
right?
These are not sequentially.
No.
These are not
Organized.
sequentially
Start with
organized,
one. There's no
right?
flow chart
Right.
on,
Yeah,
on
you
this
should be
article.
incorporating as many of these as you possibly can into your treatment planning to facilitate generalization. And if something's not working, then you have to keep working. You can't just be like, well, it didn't work, right? So that's where that sequential modification might come in.
Yeah.
I just like to put that out because my students sometimes get that confused. They're like, but I introduced the consequences in the natural environment. It still didn't work. Well, I'm like, well, you're missing something,
Yep.
right? That's not their fault. It's your fault.
So Stokes and Bear then say after these first two, again, this isn't a sequential, we're reading it as a list because that's what's written in the article. This is not a sequential stepwise process for generalization.
It's not a BuzzFeed article.
But if you just are sort of
number
like,
7.
yeah, most of my practice revolves around these first two, then
Number 8 will confuse you.
then they would say that you are probably not a practitioner who is really thinking very much about generalization ahead of time. You're sort of just responding to the failure to generalize. So
And maybe that's not on you, right? We know time is of
Oh, yeah.
there's a lot of competing contingencies.
And as we're going to get into this is actually really complicated. Generalization is not one thing. There are actually many different pieces, components, processes that are going on when we see generalized behavior change. So this article and the next one are just going to help teach you what those components are and when you might see them and when you might not, so you can sort of play detective and figure out what's really going on.
So the rest of the sort of categories are more what we think of when we think of I'm actively trying to promote generalization. So Jackie, you mentioned already the idea of introduce the new skill to natural maintaining contingencies, right?
So I did bring up introduce to natural maintaining contingencies because this is actually one of my favorite, and I love how Stokes and Bear introduce it. They're like, perhaps the most dependable of all of our tips, right? I just like how they said they're like, this is our like go-to.
Hardly deserves the name. It's like, why are you throwing shade on the,
Right.
you're talking about the dependability. You're also talking about this almost like it's not a skill.
Right? This is like the trusted babysitter that never lets you down.
Yeah.
Right?
It's a reflection of spending too long with a manuscript.
Yeah, probably.
You know what I mean? You
Adding
start
in your
adding
little-
stuff like that. You're like, this is my favorite one.
This is dependable. Yeah, but why do we even have to name it?
I hate this stupid dependable thing.
Well,
I'm never going to finish this paper.
Yeah, this is awesome. And I think this one is important during the time of which it was written, right? And I agree that it's very important now too. But if you think about the articles that were written in the late 60s and the early 70s, they were looking at how we can produce like very rapid behavior change, right? And so a lot of the contingencies that were being used were edible reinforcement, right? Sometimes aversive stimuli, but not as much. But right, they weren't trying to capitalize on what's happening in the natural environment, right? Because with the population that they were working with in those earlier studies, there wasn't really a lot of maintaining contingencies for those types of behaviors, right?
Artificial reinforcement.
And so this one, they're just talking about how can we promote the behavior to change using what's already happening in the environment. So if, I always like to think about when we talk about incidental teaching now, right? So if you want your client to open the door, right? The reinforcer here should be the door opening and they want to get out or get something in the closet, right? It shouldn't be like, oh, you opened the door, nice job, here's a high five or a hug, right? It should be whatever it is in the environment, because
I opened the door to run away from your high fives. Hooray.
Because, ultimately what we want to happen in our clinical sessions is that when we're gone, that behavior still persists, right? And the only way that behavior can still persist is if it's contacted those natural contingencies. And so they're saying, okay, why don't you just take this middleman out and program the stimuli into the environment, program the consequences that are already going to happen, be creative with how you're teaching skills so that when the teacher is gone, when the instructor is gone, right, they don't also then pull out the discriminative stimulus that leads the behavior to say, oh, here's a time when these consequences are going to be available, right? So I love this. It does take a lot of creativity for some of the programming that we work on, right? Because not everyone is going to be finding like hand washing to be reinforcing in and of itself to get right? Usually we can maintain hand washing at strength because it removes the aversive stimulus of having something dirty on your hands, but that may not be the case, right? All the times, just as a classic example. So, right, this one can be challenging to do. And you might need to start with those more artificial reinforcers, those artificial contingencies, and then make that transfer for some learners that may not have the repertoire needed to contact those contingencies yet in the environment. But having a plan in place, I think that's what their important thing is if you can't do it right out, if you can do it right out, do it, right? Program for those maintaining contingencies. And then if you can't, make sure that you have a plan to transfer eventually to those natural contingencies.
Yeah. And I would say if you were still like, well, I don't know, I think this is a stepwise list of things, I would say this is where that falls apart, because I think introducing those natural maintaining contingencies, that is probably harder than almost anything else on this list of categories, because with so many of the other categories that Stokes and Baer discuss, you still, as the experimenter or as the clinician, have so much control about the protocol. Whereas looking at natural maintaining contingencies, you're a little bit stuck with, well, what are the potential maintaining contingencies? And there is a chance of there are none. There are no maintaining contingencies. So like the hand washing example, you could say like, oh, well, if the family always gets together and washes their hand before every meal, well, that should be a natural maintaining contingency. But if you have a family that says, no, the rest of us don't really care as much about hand washing, so we don't do that consistently, okay, now you need to change the behavior of the entire family for that to become a natural maintaining contingency, which is probably a lot harder than teaching the skill in the first place with your task analysis and your chaining procedure.
Right. And they bring up a really good point about if you're trying to look at decreasing inappropriate behavior in an environment, right? Usually inappropriate behavior is maintained by the natural contingencies, right? Especially in a classroom or in family and friend peer groups, right? So that's going to be especially difficult because you're going to then have to change the behavior of everyone else that's in that group to, stop reinforcing that inappropriate behavior.
This is the area that in my sort of in my day job, I find the most frustration, because I'll have professionals say, did you teach the skill? And of course, we taught the skill. The child is doing it consistently. They don't have any additional reinforcers. Well, they don't do it here. And on the one hand, you sort of want to yell at them and say, clearly you didn't read your Stokes and Baer 97. There's no natural maintaining contingencies. Of course, they'll never do this in another setting. But then on the other hand, you want to say, that's a good point you bring up. Why aren't they engaging in this clearly mastered skill across these other environments? And I think one of the reasons that I was kind of resistant to that at various points in my career are because you do then need to question, well, what are those maintaining contingencies and how can I affect that change in an environment where I potentially have no control whatsoever, other than maybe a will or an interest of seeing the behavior occur there. So in that regard, I think that makes it a lot harder because you're often dealing with multiple individuals to create those contingencies.
Yes. Which is much more difficult than any of the other ones because you don't have control.
Oh, yeah. Let's go into multiple exemplars. You know how I run multiple exemplars? I put that in my training protocol, right? Hey, how many pictures of dogs do we have? Are they big? Are they small? Are they fuzzy? Are they not fuzzy? Are they standing? Are they sitting? I can do that myself.
Yeah, training sufficient exemplars, that number 4 is so easy.
So easy. Way easier than number 3.
This should be a number 3. Yeah. If we're recategorizing.
If we were doing this as a list of things to do in the order you do them in, then I think training,
would be
natural maintaining contingencies, that's number 9. That's the hardest one. That's
the hardest one. I agree.
So train sufficient exemplars, again, is not anything, I think, to to challenge it. I think most people probably do this, especially if you're using like a published curriculum or you're creating sort of your own discrete trial training procedures. You're going to identify your name. Well, how many different scripts? How large? How small? In books? Not in books? On the wall? On the table? You just sort of add that into your programming. You just make sure you have enough sets. And we've all read those studies.
But the problem is, as you say, as long as you have enough set, there isn't actually any research out there, which Stokes
how many sets?
Say,
yes.
Right? And even now, I don't think how many sets that is, right? So you're
Well,
like,
you could do a general case analysis.
yeah, that's true. But right, like if you're doing like just discrete trial generally, right? You're like, I have 8 sets. This will be enough.
Right.
It might not be.
No, you don't know.
You don't know.
But if you build it into your protocol of we're presenting these different sets, then you know, and there's enough research I think we see where it's sort of like first set, no good. Second set, 2 out of 3 participants got it. Third set, all of them got it. So it doesn't. Even Stokes and Bear sort of mentioned the pattern they're noticing. Like, it doesn't seem like it's that many sets you need to. How many sets? I don't know. Big shrug.
Right.
But it's probably not 1,000.
Right.
It's probably not 10. It could be 10. It's probably like 3 to 5
to
maybe.
6, yeah.
But it's a best guess.
And this one I think is overwhelming for new behavior analysts because you don't know how many sets, right? So I think anyway, I can only speak for myself, I guess, as a new BCB, I was like, I'm going to do everything right. I'm going to do everything the perfect way, right? And so I would make like thousands of sets of things. I'm like, I'm training. This is going to be sufficient, right? And sometimes it was too much. And that's great. But then I have all these stimuli that I've created that then I don't
Someone will use them eventually.
Right? Someone will, but then that sometimes leads to burnout too. So you really need to like be thoughtful about how many you are. Like, don't spend all your nights like cutting away.
You used up all the laminate in the entire company.
Oh, don't worry. I
Stuff's
broke
expensive.
my laminator.
Yeah. Yeah. So this one, I think sometimes folks get mixed up with one of the upcoming ones that we're going to talk about, program common stimuli. But here we're talking about the actual stimuli that we're looking to come to exert stimulus control over the behavior. And that is the important focus here. So if you're thinking about like your dog example, whatever stimuli you have that you're actually teaching a response toward, that's what's being varied here. Also in this category, you can look to teach towards response generalization. If there are multiple responses that you're looking to have come under stimulus control, some particular stimulus, then you can train towards that as well.
I always think if you want like a good example of what this might look like, I think of some of Peter Gerhardt's work with sex ed, with autistic adolescents, with the idea of, all right, you want to teach the individual student to name some of the the male and the female, or not, or even including sort of like non-binary folks. So let's talk about some of the exemplars that you would use. So if you just teach like, this is Jen, the teacher, but if Jen that day is wearing glasses and a sweater with her hair up, well, you better make sure that they can identify Jen. So in the training set, here's Jen, hair down, no glasses, different shirt. So mixing and matching some of those components of folks. For like a simple discrimination program.
If Jen is the target, but if Jen's not the target, but
Yes.
Jen is just the deliverer of the stimulus, then those features that you just described fall under
No, Jen's the target in that example.
Yeah.
training loosely.
Yeah, no,
We'll
Jen's the
talk about
target in the
second.
example.
Okay.
But if we were talking about training loosely,
Training loosely involves varying other non-critical features of the training environment such that those do not inadvertently come to have stimulus control over the response. So this could be,
Like, pick one.
that, or is the environment loud or quiet or bright or dark, or am I sitting at the table today or at the floor today, or is Jen wearing her hair up or wearing glasses or down and no glasses, etc. All of those are non-critical features in the environment. So
if Jen's the pictures, that's multiple
Right.
exemplars. If Jen's the one providing
deliverer,
instruction, that
yes.
could be training loosely.
exactly,
Or if Jen,
which is why I paused
Yeah.
when you gave that example.
or I've seen students only be able to respond if somebody does the inflection up, right? Like da, da, da.
Yeah.
And if you don't do that little inflection
They
with
just
your
stare
voice,
at you
then
like,
it's
what's up?
What?
What's up with your trial today?
Right. Which is
Change
a
that.
reason why, if you're looking to have behavior generalized across settings, to not use that type of voice.
It's my favorite type of voice.
Pick one.
Yeah,
Yeah, not my favorite.
pro tip, if you're teaching it should be much more natural sounding. It's not exactly like that art of training loosely of like, oh, does your SD always have to be the same? Do you always have to praise using the same language? There are lots of reasons you shouldn't do that. One of them is the less you do that, the better the chance you might be training loosely.
Right. And it does start to, look at the questions between discrimination and generalization and where you need to fall along that line in the context of teaching new skills may depend on your learner and where they're at. So for some learners, you really do need to establish that initial discrimination by having one clear SD that's really short and use it every time. And then for other learners, you're really looking to see that behavior generalized to the natural environment, be maintained by naturally occurring contingencies. And so therefore, you would want all of the interactions that you have to be a lot more, contextual to how one talks every day. So yeah, trains loosely is actually one of my favorite ones.
Yeah. And that one I feel like it's not the same as just being sloppy in your teaching.
Right. No.
But if you are sort of thinking of, I don't necessarily need to use the same scripted language at all components of this teaching trial, you are already moving towards the idea of training loosely. Though it's more than just that.
I always think about it as like loosely, like a messy bun.
Oh.
So like, do you have your hair up today or down today? It's kind of loosely. It's loosely organized.
But the messy bun is a hard bun to perfect to perfection, right? So it's not like it's messy just because you're messy, but you have to get the hairs in the right place. Yep. So that's why.
Mm-hmm.
Wow, taking it to the next level.
That's why I can never messy bun anymore.
Kind of on a similar track, but I think moving away from sort of your moment-to-moment teaching exemplars would be the number 6 of the use of indiscriminable contingencies. So this speaks more to the idea that, how do we teach every new skill? Well, with a continuous schedule of reinforcement, of course, and then eventually we will fade that schedule. Mm-hmm. But what if you never knew when reinforcement would occur? What if you didn't have a consistent SD for reinforcement? What if some kids would sometimes get reinforcement for the SD, sometimes they wouldn't, and that's how you started? Well, kids wouldn't know, or your clients wouldn't know exactly when the contingencies were in place, so the odds of them responding with a variety of ways when certain stimuli were presented would be much higher across a lot of environments. Now, again, the challenge there is if you were going to use indiscriminable contingencies already, it would have happened. And the fact that you have been called in to specifically teach this skill probably means indiscriminable contingencies will not be effective without some sort of initial, high degree of reinforcement on kind of a more intense schedule. So it's not as easy as just reinforce whenever you feel like it. I'm sure it will all work out. But it does point to one of the areas where generalization may be hard for certain students because they can't pick up on those contingencies, whether they are actively searching for them, whether they're, talking about rule-governed behavior. It can be really hard to, put kind of that whole teaching paradigm together for the child. So can we add some unpredictability at some point or earlier in the chain of teaching as part of generalization? So again, if you're not thinning your schedules of reinforcement, as well as sort of looking for ways to remove certain discriminative cues, then you are probably going to struggle with generalization. Though again, maybe not. You can't say for sure.
I think this one is my least favorite because I think I think it's hard to do, but I think it's easy to do wrong. Easy to do wrong, hard to do, because we all want our students to learn as quickly as possible, right? And we know that with intermittent reinforcement, we may not see as fast of as acquisition, but then you have to balance like efficacy with efficiency, right? Or efficacy with effectiveness, right? So if we took a little longer to teach a skill using, let's say, a different, not a continuous schedule reinforcement, but then generalization occurred, would that be beneficial, right? So yes, and maybe, but that is a really fine line to walk. And I think that is a hard skill to learn.
Moving on to number 7, the idea of programming common stimuli. And this I think really kind of captured the idea that we see in a lot of like the general case analysis literature.
Yeah.
So I don't know if we need to spend a lot of time on it because we got a whole episode devoted to general case analysis.
It's episode 73.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I like this one. I think this one shows that you've thought about where you want the behavior to occur, right? And you've programmed into your training sessions things that might be relevant in those those non-training sessions,
Yeah.
right?
It's almost like I can't do natural maintaining contingencies, but I can think about the common stimuli in the settings where reinforcement is probably not going to occur.
Yeah.
And teach to that.
My favorite example for this one is when you might be trying to teach hand washing at a school, and the school has those like wall pump soaps, right? Which I think are really challenging for a lot of kids to learn how to use, because you need to use both hands, and it's like not a movement you've done at any other point in time, and it's just really tricky. So even if you were to teach that successfully with the wall soap, there's really not a lot of guarantee that that's going to generalize outside of the wall soap setting, right? And we all know that you can soap up your hands in lots of different ways. So instead, what I think is a good idea to do is to check with the family on what their soap looks like at home. Do they use bar soap? Do they use pump soap? Do they use foam soap or what have you, right? And then get one that's like what they use at home at school. So then you're using the same one at school to teach the skill that they're actually going to be using at home.
I think
programming comes to.
I'd go one up too and say, hey, where do you commonly go and what kind of soap dispensers do they have there? Because little Billy loves karate class, and they got the cool ones where the soap is attached to the sink, and you stick your hand under it and it just automatically dispenses. But does
only
the
if
child
you hold it just
right? And does the child understand that that's not the faucet? And then they're surprised, like, what the heck? This faucet is broken. It's giving me soap, but now what? There's some factors you want to be thinking about.
Great point.
Yeah.
I love those, by the way.
Oh, those are the best. I sort of want President Biden, get on that. The mandatory awesome soap automatic dispensers, please. I'm sure that is top of the list of problems in America. Number 8, the idea of mediating generalization, which, again, I feel like that should be number 3 in terms of the actual generalization. What if we just taught kids that, you know what? You can use some common language. You know, we can use phrases to sort of cue the presence of reinforcement, or we can add, additional verbal mediation to be like, hey, you know that thing you did over here? Guess what? Do it over here too. Like just adding in some of those simple verbal cues, which again is not foolproof because verbal mediation is not always going to work in these situations.
For some reason, this one I think is hard for people to grasp.
I think so too.
I think the wording mediate generalization trips you up, right? They might, if they were going to redo this, they might want to rechange this one because I think it might be a little too technical.
What do you think would be a better, maybe less?
Well, it's really about like maybe providing context or.
I kind of like the idea of context,
right? Because
at least for the practitioner, you wouldn't tell the client, just think about the context play.
But if you're thinking about a practitioner, like what can you provide as like contextual cues that then could promote generalization? But this one I find is really hard for students to kind of grasp. The other ones they kind of understand and they can like provide examples. This ones are like, what?
I think cue is a good word. It's something that's in the training setting that's also going to be present in the generalization setting that will function as a cue or a prompt for the behavior that will meet reinforcement.
And Stokes and Bear sort of go a little bit more into. I don't think they gave this one as much detail as some of the other sections. They're like, just see this in the self-control and self-management literature, which is like, okay, that's. I get you there that self-control and self-management is important, but exactly what should that look like? But the idea of, identifying those cues and possibly teaching the client to identify those cues themselves, to know what rules are or not in place so that they can engage in certain behaviors or engage in other, behaviors from different response class. But again, I don't think they go into as much detail here as some of the other sections. So yeah, I can see Jackie, why students might be like, all right, I guess I'll try to do that. I'll try to mediate that generalization. And
that feels weird.
I'll just go back to train and hope, and I'll really play on the hope part.
The wording just feels weird. I remember as a master's student, I glazed over at that section.
Yeah. And then finally, train to generalize.
In parentheses.
Yeah. And I think this one, I think in some of my examples, I was mixing up mediate generalization and train to generalize. So again, the idea of, the language of this is the same, like this is the same thing over here. Like this is what this looks like. Yes. This looks like that. I sort of conflated the two in my last example. But, can we teach our students to compare a new problem to an old problem? Hey, remember when this happened and you responded in this way? Well, this is close enough. You can respond the exact same way, and you'll probably get the outcome you're looking for. Which again, I kind of made me think of things like lag schedules of reinforcement.
I like that.
But I think
I had a dream about lag schedules the other night.
You had a dream about lag schedules.
Wow. Yep, this is my life now. Dreaming about lag schedules. Having a meeting with someone talking about lag schedules. It's really weird.
But again, even with the idea of the lag schedule, I think training to generalize goes beyond a lag schedule because I think that's the process that you do sort of in the lab environment or in the clinical environment. Whereas training to generalize, you're not teaching someone to use a lag schedule themselves. You either did it or you didn't do it already. This is a more actively teaching the response of generalization.
Yeah.
How do you generalize?
Yeah, it's I think this one's specifically for the practitioner, right? Thinking of generalization as an operant response and not as something that just occurs. Mm-hmm. So actively thinking about how do you promote that and teach that as a specific response.
Yeah, and even some of the examples of if somebody tries to do something, engage in a behavior that they had previously learned for a similar but different problem, even if it's not successful, could we add as the instructor, as the teacher, could we provide reinforcement for that attempt? Mm-hmm. Hey, good job remembering XYZ and engaging in behavior A, even though it didn't work, that was a good idea. Could we add that into some of our protocols? But again, I think depending on your learner, you are going to get a little bit farther or have a little bit harder time with the idea of training your client to generalize.
Right.
So at the end, I do appreciate that they also then are saying, well, here's 9 things. 7 of them are generalization. 2 of them are sort of something that people do.
They're like that.
Yeah, right.
And then they give us the best practice steps, which again are the idea of, okay, when you're teaching a response, is it one that could enter the natural community? Could the subject maybe learn how to cue their desire for reinforcement? Make sure you're training lots of different exemplars and think about how you're loosening your experimental control over those stimuli and those responses. So maybe you have concurrent examples, you're varying instruction. I think there's been some good papers on discrete trial training in terms of what are some good magic numbers, like training 6 exemplars to start is way better than I think a lot of us probably started with 1 or 3. 6 or 7 actually seems to get pretty good results when it comes to maintenance and generalization. Again, that's only a few papers. It's not definitive, but that might be an area you look at. Are you varying your instructions and your SDs? Are you varying the reinforcers that are delivered? Is there any way that you could think about delaying reinforcement or concealing which contingencies are in place at different times? And also make sure that whatever stimuli you're using, as many exemplars as you have, if none of them occur in the environment that will be of value to your client, you need to go back to the drawing board and start again because they should be relevant to the environment the client will be living in, not the environment that you happen to be teaching in. And then if you can teach other sort of self-recording kinds of techniques, that's also good too. I bet that will help with generalization, although they kind of peter out with some of those last suggestions.
Again, very tired by the end of this article.
It's a great article, but when you get to 9, you're like, some of those articles that I read weren't as much fun. All right, so let's take a quick break, and then when we come back, what does Johnston have to say about all of these shenanigans? We'll be right back.
Do you want to be a BCBA?
Sure, we all do.
Now you can come to Regis College in Weston, Mass. to get your graduate degree.
Choose from any one of these courses.
Masters of Science in Applied Behavior Analysis.
Masters of Science in Special Education.
Dual degree in Special Ed and ABA.
Or be eligible for your postmaster's certificate.
You can complete your degree and be ready to sit for the exam in 2 years. And our 2017 grads had a 100% pass rate on the BACB exam.
Come enjoy practicum placement support, ethics mini handbooks, PhD-level professors, small class sizes, and a service trip to Iceland.
If interested, don't delay. Supplies are limited. Learn more at regiscollege.edu.
Again, that's www.regiscollege.edu, regiscollege.edu. One more time, www.regiscollege.edu.
See you there!
And we are back talking about generalization and generality. But before we get to kind of the next step of this discussion, I want to remind our listeners that ABA Inside Track is ACE approved. By listening to the show, you're able to earn 1 learning credit. We're ACE approved and Quabbr approved. Almost forgot there. We got both of them, folks. You will earn 1 learning credit for listening. Then going to our website, abainsidetrack.com/getceus. You can also click on the link in your show note description to go directly to that page. You're going to need to enter in some information, though, including 2 secret code words. I'm going to give you the first one now. It's flash. Dun, 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 dun. Flash. Dun, 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 dun. Oh.
It's just Flash.
That's the code word. Dun, 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 dun.
FLASH.
Yes.
Flash.
Flash from Queen's soundtrack to
No.
the Flash Gordon movie.
Don't know.
No? Okay.
That's why I was giving it to everyone that's me.
But everyone who's cool and knows the Flash Gordon soundtrack, you can sing the whole thing while you type in just the word Flash. All right, Diana, you were champing at the bit to talk about Johnston and his response to Stokes and Bear.
I don't think it was a response.
I don't know. It felt like a response.
I think in some ways it is a response.
It's like a rap battle.
It's just 2 years later.
2 years later.
It takes a while to come up
It's a
with
diss
these
track. It's a
responses.
diss paper.
No, I don't think it's a diss paper. And I think that, the criticisms that he brings up related to this topic are that Stokes and Bear would have also agreed with at the time of writing of their paper. So it's not as though he uncovered some great new
We're not like, oh,
perspective.
Right.
He's really doing what you two already noted earlier, which is Stokes and Bear trying to give this really, broad sort of inclusive picture of generalization. Say, look, we have this and this and this and this that all talk about generalization, and we've tried to categorize it for you. In response to that, he's coming back and saying, okay, you've included all of these things underneath this now really huge umbrella of generalization, but actually there's a lot of different stuff happening here, and maybe we should be a little more precise.
So it's not it's not a diss paper, Diana. It's an actually
Probably
paper.
Actually,
Yeah.
more so. And I know when I gave the resources for this at the top of the show, I forgot to mention that there's also in the good old white book, CHH, Cooper, Heron, and Heward, in the chapter on generalization, there's a very good table that summarizes some of the stuff that's discussed in these 2 papers. If you have the 3rd edition, it's on page 720.
I don't remember so many fancy boxes in my second edition.
Box 30.1, which maybe means it's chapter 30. Yes, that's exactly what that means. And it's titled Perspectives on the Sometimes Confusing and Misleading Terminology of Generalization.
Sometimes confusing, Professor.
So if you're like, I don't know if I want to read Johnston, you could actually go in your Cooper book and read this table or this box here and get a pretty decent synopsis.
What if you're old like me and you only have the 2nd edition and you don't want to shell out another $200?
you can find it online.
Okay.
But
I didn't tell you that.
Listen to this show, I guess.
Yeah.
Oh, well, I'm already here, so I'll just listen to the show then.
Okay. So what we have discussed so far are lots and lots of different ways in which clinicians or practitioners might approach generalization if they're looking to see generalized behavior change outside of the training setting for their clients. But what we haven't really done is break down what of all those things that we talked about, what actually is stimulus generalization, what actually is response generalization, what actually are changes in stimulus control, etc. And we end up having a lot of different things that are occurring underneath this category that Johnson is looking to respond to. So he says, we use this term generalization pretty loosely. And we also have a term that we use sometimes as well, which is generality, but they don't have perfect overlap between the two. The 2 terms actually mean something different. So when we talk about stimulus generalization, in which we see responding occur, initially be trained underneath the context of one stimulus and come to occur as sort of varying strengths under similar stimuli, that is potentially, one phenomenon, one behavioral process there. And then we have response generalization, by which one response is trained in the presence of some context or stimulus, and we come to see additional other responses also occur in the same context, which then may or may not be met with reinforcement. We can put both of those terms underneath the umbrella of generalization, but as I just described, it's 2 different things that are happening. And then we might also have generality. Usually when we're talking about generality, We're talking about, some certain set of findings or principles that might be in play under a certain set of conditions. And then we are determining whether we also see those findings hold true under a secondary set of conditions, right? Mm-hmm. But all of these are kind of, different things, but we end up using the terms awfully loosely when we're talking about generalization, such that all of them could potentially fit underneath this big old umbrella.
It's not my fault. I was trained loosely. Too loosely, it sounds like.
Oh, nice. So
I appreciate it. Thank you.
His main point here is that we should probably be a little bit more precise in our terms. And that's probably true, right? If we really want to get into the nitty gritty of it. But his other concern here is that we are potentially putting the onus of generalization and this is kind of a dangerous thing from his perspective, like inside the person, right? So we're saying, not just we see generalized behavior change or behavior change occurred under these different settings, but rather, so-and-so generalized. So, putting the behavior kind of like inside the person rather than really being under control of the environmental contextual variables, which is where it actually lies. And so he's cautioning us against that as well. And by working to use language more precisely, then we will potentially prevent some of that happening. So, sometimes you do hear those terms thrown around, right? Like this person generalized their behavior, which, that sounds like a homunculus type of thing going on there, or the generalizability of a certain behavior or, stimulus context, when that language is sort of straying even further than the precise language that we should be using in this context.
Well, in that example you gave, I think generalizability sounds like it's just the bastardized version of what would be more parsimoniously referred to as generality, the generality of that response. Mm-hmm. In that specific example, I think also generalizability tends to be a term that I have seen in published papers. I thought it was one that I just made up and you guys made fun of me.
Now it's in the Cooper book. So it is a real word.
Okay.
But I did make fun of you.
You did make fun of me. I know.
I don't like it.
If it makes you feel any better, Jackie, sometimes the ways you make fun of me on this podcast, I make fun of with other supervisees and other students. And they're like, I never forgot that it was so mean. And I know. I learned from the best.
I know. I'm so sorry. I'm working on my kindness.
Hey, I remembered it. That's what's important.
No, it's
to some
not.
extent.
I should have done it with kindness.
It's okay.
Hopefully you have a good relationship with your supervisees, Rob.
Yeah.
They were just in jest.
Sure. Yeah. It's great. I'm sure. Yes.
Right. So
not as much fun as Jackie, but I try to be fun.
All right. So Johnston is talking about, all of the things that could be happening in this non-training setting that we're sort of lumping in together as generalization. In fact, he says when we talk about generalization is the only way to produce change in the non-training setting, then we're leaving out a lot of several potential present and important processes that may also be occurring in that environment, such as if we're seeing behavior change occur in the non-training setting, then we could be looking at stimulus generalization. We could be looking at response generalization. We could also be looking at changes in stimulus control. In that context, we should not forget about the history of reinforcement that individual has experienced both in the training and the non-training setting. We should be considering the current schedules of reinforcement. So that goes back to indiscriminate contingencies as well, right? Thinking about how those are at play here, as well as just other uncontrolled variables that might be present in the setting too. So just because we're seeing behavior change in the non-training setting, we can't just call it generalization because, one, that means a lot of different things. And two, we are potentially overusing that term in a way that's causing it to start to take on a life of its own, right? And it kind of can become a thing out of our control if we're giving it too much power. So instead, just, we might see behavior change over here, but in order to determine what actually is happening, we need to look really closely at the variables that are present. And sometimes it may end up being stimulus generalization or response generalization, which is when we say generalization, that's usually what we mean. But it also could be lots of other stuff happening in that environment too. And we may be able to parse that out, but we shouldn't automatically just consider it to be stimulus or response generalization. So his point as well here is that it's just calling it all generalization isn't going to get us as far as maybe we want to. We should really be thinking about the environmental control that's in that setting and utilizing that perspective on why we may or may not see behavior change occur could help us be more precise in how we're really talking about behavior. He says that expecting to see behavior occur in the non-training setting without some additional types of trainings and supports is kind of weird, basically, right?
I agree with him. Yeah, I agree.
He said, to quote him, "At no point does behavior become permanently self-supporting or independent of environmental control," which is totally true, right?
Truth. That's like
Yes.
a hashtag truth.
Yeah.
TikTok video, Johnston.
Yeah, exactly. So we wouldn't expect to see behavior occur in the generalized setting without, some other variables being present there to help support the behavior. So our ultimate goal is that we see behavior. We look to transfer the stimulus control from the training setting to the generalization setting and to naturally occurring stimuli and being maintained by naturally occurring reinforcers. So that's kind of the whole point of everything. We talk about it in terms of generalization or generality, but the main point is that type of environmental control being maintained in maybe, less sterile settings, you could say. And then to quote him again, the issue is not so much how to get quote unquote generalization, but how to arrange control over different environmental conditions, which results in desired influences on behavior.
I mean, one of the things that I liked about this paper, reading it this time versus, say, like in grad school or at other times, and I've sort of come back to the concept of generality and generalization, was sort of thinking of generality as kind of being more than the sum of its parts in an idea, in a way. So, we've got like stimulus and response generalization, and that's a part of it. But really that idea of how many dimensions of generality there are, where would we see generality across, for example, how do certain procedures, move across, say, different subjects or responses or settings? Is there, the generality of various variables or the methods being used? And so really thinking it almost of a almost aspirational idea of, how can we determine where generality exists in even certain procedures, and then Johnston gives the example of, say, timeout. Will timeout work in other situations? And if so, why? So it felt like generality is asking some big questions about procedures on the whole, rather than how does procedure X work for participant Y in settings A, B, and C, which is a little bit more of where Stokes and Baer were focusing their efforts in their paper. This felt more like this is the big question, life, the universe, and everything sort of idea of generality of, what components are going to, lead to novel behaviors or same behaviors in new environments across a wide swath of individuals and settings and responses and stimuli. So I don't know if that necessarily has made me a better person to discuss the idea of generality versus generalization, but I do think the scope tends to be one of the ways that I differentiate those two terms. And at least they seem to be within the context of these two articles. Again, from a day-to-day basis, whether that is relevant to how you talk with precision in your own practice, I don't know if that necessarily helps. But that was something that I was thinking a lot about as I was sort of rereading these two papers in terms of some other differences between both the papers and then the terms being used.
Yep. So, Johnson defines generality as characteristics of data which describe some meaning beyond the circumstances of their origin. And I think that in the day-to-day that we discuss the term generality, that's usually the way that you just described it is how we talk about it, right? So the big picture, like generality of findings or processes, is more commonly how we talk about generality, like your example about timeout procedures. And it kind of implies like a universality to whatever the concept is. So I think that makes a lot of sense. What then he goes on to say is that we use that term generality for kind of the big picture things, but we could also talk about generality for the smaller things too. It's just that we tend to use generalization in that circumstance instead. But he breaks it down. We could say he has a little diagram in there. There's generality across certain things and generality of certain things. So generality across is the way we probably more commonly think about it. So generality across species, across subjects, across responses, and across settings. And then generality of different variables or of different methods or of different processes. And so some of those pieces are kind of more familiar to us to use that terminology, but others we've tended to use generalization in that way. And I don't think that anyone out there needs to like revamp how they're talking about generality or start using generality instead of generalization, right? Because we have great conceptual definitions for stimulus and response generalization that are specific. It's just that we tend to use the overall term relatively broadly. And we can, conceptualize that and fit it underneath this umbrella that Johnston's presenting of generality, but also don't feel like you have to then now change your vocabulary related to these two. It's just good practice to start to think about, when I say generalization, what do I actually mean? Mm-hmm. What is the thing that I'm looking to change here, and how will I know if it changes? And how do I know, what the process of behavior change is? Or am I using that term kind of loosely? Mm-hmm. Is kind of the bigger take-home point as far as I am concerned.
Well then, speaking of take-home points, I think it's time for us to move into Dissemination Station. Oh, in case you couldn't tell, that was Diana doing the sound effect, because unfortunately Jackie just had to step out a minute or so ago, so wasn't able to do our sound effect for us. If you could tell the difference, listener, then bravo to you. So when it comes down to it, Diana, do you think it's enough for sort of the average behavior analyst to have sort of a passing knowledge of generality, generalization, not exactly the same thing, but at the end of the day, what's important is how I am thinking about that process of stimulus and response generalization moment to moment for the benefit of my client? Or do you think that something gets lost when we don't keep an eye on sort of that big picture of, generality?
I think for me, the important points are that we are recognizing that generality is not some type of, or generalization is not some type of like internal phenomenon that is occurring within an individual, but we're just talking about the stimulus control and environmental variables that are present or not present in the environment that's going to maintain, or it's going to evoke responding and then maintain that responding over time. Like that's it. So the distinction between the training setting and the generalization setting is one that we could make, but ultimately it's not as maybe useful, right, as we want it to be if we were trying to approach it with like that train and hope perspective, right? Like, oh, we trained it here and we hope it happens over here. Well, just like Johnson said, there's never an environment in which we are free from the influence of stimuli and reinforcement that's present in those environments. We just have to know if they're the ones that are going to evoke responding and then maintain it. So for me, that's a really useful perspective, right? And it's not like training happens here, generalization happens here, right? It frees you from that type of binary perspective, which I think is helpful.
Mm-hmm. If you had to pick one of the 9 Stokes and Bear recommendations, because there was a terrible electronic fire and all copies got burnt up and only one were left of those 9, which one would you pick to make sure that future generations thought of in planning for the process of generalization in their treatments?
You mean which one is most useful?
Well, to you personally, because
Number 3, use naturally maintaining reinforcers, or ensure that responding is going to maintain in the presence of naturally occurring reinforcers is really critical. How about you?
Oh boy, I don't know. I'm sort of torn between train sufficient exemplars and program common stimuli. I love both of those. They're sort of two sides of the same coin, I think, in a lot of ways. But there's just something about trying to, I feel like I'm in a contest against the stimuli in the environment. It's like me against the stimuli in the environment in my teaching procedure. And if I can think of just enough exemplars, or if I train just enough of the relevant stimuli in my client's, terminal environment, then I'll be one step ahead of inanimate objects in terms of promoting generalization. I don't know. It feels like it's a good challenge. I think it's always exciting to think about how will this skill manifest in real life, and how can I program in such a way that it actually does become a meaningful and socially significant skill rather than a trick I taught in my cubby.
Right. Yes. And Johnston does talk about that. I forgot to mention that part. He says that generalization should not just be a quote unquote bag of tricks, which I feel like is in response to Stokes and Bear.
Yeah. I mean, I love a good bag of tricks, but there's a time and a place. And possibly generalization research papers is not one of them. Well, folks, that brings us to the end of our episode. We hope you enjoyed hearing about generalization and generality and reviewing these two classic articles. We want to say thank you very much for doing so. We'd really appreciate it if you like the show, thinking of subscribing and maybe leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you like to get your podcasts. There are a lot of other places you can reach out to ABA Inside Track. Certainly, we're on almost all the social media platforms as ABA Inside Track. You can find these episodes posted on YouTube as well with the YouTube subtitling feature. You can go to abainsidetrack.com to get access to all of our episodes, as well as links to our previous episodes, links to the articles that are discussed, and to purchase CEs. And speaking of purchasing CEs, you probably want that second secret code word, don't you? It's PURSE, P-U-R-S-E, whether it's a bag of holding things or a way you're smooshing up your face. Either way, PURSE. And finally, if you'd like even more ABA Inside Track content, getting episodes a week ahead of time, discounts on the CE store, and access to our super long book club podcasts, go to patreon.com/ABA Inside Track, where you can subscribe. We're going to have some polls coming up at the time of this in terms of what our winter book club will be, some live episodes coming up in the future that you can join, but only if you subscribe on patreon.com/ABA Inside Track. Thanks so much to Dr. Jim Carr for recording our intro and outro music, for Kyle Sturry for our interstitial music, and of course, Dan Thabit of the Podcast Doctors for his fabulous editing work. We'll be back next week with another fun-filled episode, but until then, keep responding. Bye!
Bye!